Ethan Miller was 15 years old when he learned how quickly a house could stop being a home. It happened on a late October evening, the kind where the sky turns gray too early and the air carries that sharp warning that winter is close. The trees along Maple Street were already half bare, their leaves crushed into damp piles on the sidewalk. Ethan stood in the narrow hallway of the house he'd lived in since he was 8, gripping the straps of an old backpack that suddenly felt heavier than it ever had before. "You're not my responsibility anymore." The words came from Rick, his stepfather, sharp and final. No shouting, no drama. Just a flat sentence delivered like a receipt being handed across a counter. Ethan didn't argue. He'd learned a long time ago that arguing only made things worse. Rick had never liked him. Not really. Ever since Ethan's mom passed away 2 years earlier, the house had grown colder in ways that had nothing to do with the weather. Rick worked long hours, drank longer nights, and treated Ethan like a reminder of a life he didn't want. Bills piled up, patience ran out, and eventually, so did whatever thin thread of obligation Rick felt toward a kid who wasn't his. "You can crash with a friend," Rick added, already turning back toward the living room. "Figure it out." But Ethan didn't have friends like that. Not the kind with spare beds and parents who asked questions. So he stepped outside. The door shut behind him with a dull click, quiet but permanent. The porch light flickered once, then went dark. And just like that, Ethan was alone. The cold crept in fast. It slid through his hoodie, slipped down the back of his neck, settled deep into his bones. He stood there for a moment, staring at the door, half expecting it to open again. It didn't. Ethan walked. He didn't know where he was going, only that standing still felt worse. The town was small, the kind of place where everyone recognized everyone else's trucks, where rumors traveled faster than weather warnings. As he passed darkened houses, he wondered how many people inside even knew he existed. How many would care if they did? By the time he reached the edge of town, his hands were numb. He shoved them into his pockets and found nothing there. No phone, no money. Just a folded photo he'd kept since he was a kid. His mom, smiling, arm wrapped around his shoulders at the county fair. He unfolded it carefully, like it might tear if he wasn't gentle enough. "I'm trying," he whispered, though he wasn't sure who he was saying it to. That night, Ethan slept in the back seat of an abandoned car behind a closed gas station. The windows were cracked, the seatbelt dug into his side. Every sound made him jolt awake. Wind rattled the metal frame. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked and then went quiet. He barely slept at all. The next morning, the sun rose pale and weak, offering light but no warmth. Ethan's breath fogged the air as he climbed out of the car. His joints ached, his stomach growled, and the reality settled in with crushing weight. He had nowhere to go. School crossed his mind. Teachers, counselors. But school meant questions. Questions meant calls. Calls meant Rick. And Ethan couldn't face that. Not yet. Maybe not ever. By the second night, the temperature dropped even lower. Frost crept across the ground, sparkling under streetlights like broken glass. Ethan layered cardboard under his hoodie, scavenged from a dumpster, and learned how thin fabric really was when winter decided to test you. People noticed him then, not in a helpful way. Some looked through him, eyes sliding past as if he were part of the scenery. Others stared a little too long, suspicion flickering across their faces. A man in a pickup truck slowed down once, rolled his window halfway, then shook his head and drove off. "Troublemaker," someone muttered as they passed. Ethan heard it. He always heard it. By the third day, hunger clawed at him. He scavenged half a sandwich from a trash can behind a diner, brushed the dirt off, and ate it anyway. Shame burned hotter than the cold, but it didn't stop him. What hurt more was the silence. No one asked his name. No one asked how old he was. No one asked why a kid should be wandering the streets with nowhere to sleep. That night, as he sat behind the old lumber yard, wrapped in a tarp he'd found, Ethan made a decision. Not because he felt brave, not because he felt strong, but because he was tired of feeling invisible. If the world wasn't going to make room for him, he would make his own. Beyond the fence, past the rusted equipment and broken pallets, there was a strip of land most people ignored. Overgrown, uneven, forgotten. The kind of place adults warned kids to stay away from. Ethan stared at it for a long time. The wind cut through the trees. The sky darkened again. And something steady, stubborn, and quiet settled in his chest. He adjusted the straps of his backpack, took a breath that burned his lungs, and stepped toward the shadows. Winter was coming, and somehow he was still standing. The land behind the old lumber yard didn't look like much. Most people drove past it without a second glance, eyes fixed on the road ahead, minds already somewhere else. Rusted fencing leaned at awkward angles. Tall weeds clawed toward the sky. Broken boards and scraps of metal lay scattered like the remains of something that had been abandoned and left to rot. To everyone else, it was nothing. To Ethan, it was possibility. He stood there as dusk crept in. The sky bruised purple and gray. Wind tugging at his hoodie. His breath came slow, measured. The air smelled like wet earth and old pine. Somewhere in the distance, a train horn echoed, long and lonely. No one would look for him here. That thought brought a strange sense of relief. Ethan slipped through a gap in the fence, careful not to snag his backpack. The ground dipped slightly, forming a shallow basin hidden from the road by a line of scraggly trees. At the center was what looked like an old foundation, cracked concrete half buried by dirt and leaves, probably from a shed that had been torn down years ago. He crouched, pressing his palm against the cold surface. It was solid, not warm, not safe, but solid. He remembered something his dad had once said. Back when things were different. Back when Saturdays meant fishing trips and cheap burgers instead of empty rooms and slammed doors. You don't need much to survive, his dad had told him. You just need something that won't give up on you. Ethan swallowed hard and got to work. The first night, he didn't build anything. He just cleared space, dragged away broken pallets, stacked usable boards in one pile, useless junk in another. His hands grew raw, fingers stiff with cold, but the movement kept him warm, kept him focused. When it got too dark to see, he sat on the edge of the foundation and wrapped himself in the tarp he'd found earlier. The wind still cut through, but not as badly. The ground beneath him felt steadier than the car seat he'd slept on before. He slept in short bursts, waking at every sound. A branch snapping, a distant engine, an animal moving through the brush. Each time his heart pounded, adrenaline sharp and unforgiving. But morning came, and he was still there. Over the next few days, Ethan settled into a rhythm. Mornings were for scavenging. He checked dumpsters behind stores just after opening hours, before trash was buried under fresh waste. He learned which places threw out food and which locked their bins tight. He found bruised apples, day-old bread, a dented can of soup someone had tossed without opening. Afternoons were for building. He dragged stones from the tree line, choosing the heavier ones, the kind that didn't crumble when you tapped them together. He remembered science class, how mass held heat, how the earth didn't change temperature as fast as air. It wasn't a plan, not really, more like instincts pieced together from half-remembered lessons and quiet observation. He dug. The ground was hard but not frozen yet. Each shovel of dirt felt like a small victory. He wasn't digging a hole to disappear into. He was digging down to survive. The deeper he went, the less the wind touched him. By the end of the week, his hands were blistered, his arms sore, his face wind-burned. But there was a shape now, a shallow pit lined with stones. Boards leaned carefully to form a low roof, covered with dirt and leaves for weight and insulation. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't finished, but it was his. On the seventh night, the temperature dropped sharply. Frost glazed the weeds. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the fence like it wanted to tear the place apart. Ethan climbed into the shelter and pulled the tarp tight behind him. He held his breath. The cold was still there, but it was different, muted, less aggressive. The earth around him seemed to hold the chill at bay. Slow it down. Give him time. His hands shook as he lit a small candle he'd found in a thrift store donation bin. The flame flickered, fragile but stubborn. Shadows danced along the dirt walls. For the first time in days, Ethan felt something close to calm. Not happiness, not safety, but control. That feeling didn't last long. 2 days later, someone found him. It was a pair of boys from school, cutting through the yard as a shortcut. Ethan heard them before he saw them. Laughing, loud, careless. He froze, heart racing. "Dude, what is that?" one of them said. Ethan stepped out slowly, hands visible, like he was approaching a wild animal. The boys stared at him, eyes wide, then broke into grins. "No way," the other one laughed. "Is that like a fort or a hole?" Ethan didn't answer. "Man, that's messed up," the first boy said, shaking his head. "You actually live here?" Word spread fast after that. By the end of the week, people were talking. Not to him. About him. The crazy kid behind the lumber yard. The runaway. The problem waiting to happen. Someone said he'd freeze to death before Thanksgiving. Someone else joked that he was trying to be some kind of caveman. Ethan heard the laughter when he walked past town. Felt it like a weight on his shoulders. At night, alone in his shelter, doubt crept in. What if they were right? What if this was stupid? What if he was just delaying the inevitable? The wind picked up again, colder than before. Winter was no longer a warning. It was a promise. Ethan stared at the dirt ceiling above him. Candlelight flickering. Breath steady but shallow. His body ached. His stomach was empty. His future felt like a long stretch of darkness. But beneath all of it, beneath the fear, beneath the exhaustion, there was something else. Determination. Quiet. Unyielding. He pulled his jacket tighter, pressed his palm against the earth wall, and closed his eyes. They could laugh. They could doubt. He would keep building, because this wasn't just a shelter anymore. It was proof that he hadn't disappeared, and winter hadn't beaten him yet. At first, the looks were quick. Side glances, half-turns of the head. Conversations that stopped the moment Ethan walked by. Then they got longer. People didn't just notice him anymore. They watched him. Ethan felt it everywhere. At the edge of town, near the grocery store, by the school parking lot. Even on the road leading toward the lumber yard, where cars slowed just enough for drivers to stare before moving on. No one asked him how he was doing. They just wanted to see what he'd become. One afternoon, as Ethan hauled a wheelbarrow full of rocks toward his shelter, a truck rolled to a stop nearby. 2 men sat inside, windows down, coffee cups in hand. They didn't get out. Didn't say anything at first. Just watched. Ethan kept walking, jaw tight, eyes forward. His arms burned. Sweat ran cold down his back. He could feel their eyes pressing into him like weight. "Kid's gonna freeze out here," one of them finally muttered, loud enough for Ethan to hear. The other laughed. "Or starve." The truck pulled away. Ethan didn't stop moving until his hands were shaking too badly to grip the wheelbarrow handles anymore. That night, the laughter followed him into the dark. It echoed in his head as he lay in his shelter, staring at the low dirt ceiling. Each breath felt shallow, uneven. The wind slipped through small gaps he hadn't sealed yet, whispering against his ears like it was repeating their words. Freeze. Starve. He pressed his hands against his ribs, grounding himself. He counted his breaths. In. Out. Slow. Still, doubt crept in. What if they were right? What if this was just stubbornness dressed up as courage? Ethan thought about Rick's face when he'd been kicked out. That flat, exhausted look. The certainty that Ethan wasn't worth the trouble. The memory hit harder than the cold ever had. The next morning, things escalated. When Ethan returned from scavenging, he found footprints near his shelter. Fresh. Too many to be animals. Someone had been there. Someone had looked inside. His chest tightened. Nothing was stolen, but something had changed. The place no longer felt invisible. The world had noticed, and it didn't approve. Later that day, a police cruiser rolled slowly past the lumberyard fence. It didn't stop. It didn't have to. The message was clear. "We see you." Ethan started avoiding town as much as possible. He took longer routes through the trees. He scavenged later when fewer people were around. Hunger became a familiar companion again, but it felt safer than the stairs. Still, the rumors grew. Someone called him a runaway. Someone else said he was dangerous. A woman at the gas station whispered that it was only a matter of time before something bad happened. Ethan heard it all. Each word chipped away at him, wearing him down in places he didn't know were exposed. One evening, as he worked on reinforcing the walls with more stone, a group of kids showed up near the fence. Older than him. Louder. Crueler. "Yo, cave boy!" one of them shouted. Ethan froze. "You gonna hibernate all winter?" Another laughed. "You got a pet bear in there or what?" They tossed a rock. It hit the ground near his feet. Harmless but deliberate. Ethan's heart slammed against his ribs. His hands curled into fists. For a split second, he wanted to scream, to throw something back, to tell them they didn't know anything about him. Instead, he bent down, picked up another stone, and kept working. The laughter followed him as they walked away. That night, alone again, Ethan broke. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly. Tears slipped down his face as he sat with his back against the earth wall, knees pulled tight to his chest. His shoulders shook, breath hitching as weeks of fear and exhaustion finally caught up with him. He wasn't crying because he was weak. He was crying because he was 15, cold, hungry, and painfully aware that no one was coming to save him. "I didn't do anything wrong," he whispered into the dark. The words felt small, fragile. For a long moment, all he heard was the wind and his own breathing. Then slowly, something shifted. Ethan wiped his face with the sleeve of his jacket. He looked around the shelter, not as a hiding place, but as a work in progress. He noticed how the stones he'd placed earlier still felt faintly warmer than the air, how the dirt walls muffled the sound of the wind. It wasn't much, but it was real, and it was working. The next day, Ethan changed how he built. Instead of rushing, he became deliberate, careful. He angled the stones slightly inward, packing dirt between them. He sealed gaps with mud and leaves. He paid attention to where the wind hit hardest and reinforced those spots. He wasn't building out of desperation anymore. He was building with intention. People noticed that too. The laughter didn't stop, but it softened. Curiosity crept in where mockery had been. Someone slowed down long enough to actually look, not just stare. A man walking his dog paused near the fence one morning, brow furrowed. He didn't speak, but his eyes lingered on the structure longer than anyone else's had before. Ethan felt something unfamiliar stir in his chest. Not hope, not yet, but resolve. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the temperature dropped fast, Ethan crawled into his shelter and pulled the entrance closed behind him. The air inside felt different now, still cold, but steady, predictable. He lay back, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind rage outside. Let them watch, let them doubt, let them laugh. Winter was almost here, and when it arrived, the world was going to find out whether Ethan Miller was just another kid who disappeared, or someone who refused to be erased. The first real storm didn't come quietly. It came like a warning the town had been ignoring. By late afternoon, the sky turned the color of steel. The wind sharpened, cutting through the trees with a sound like tearing fabric. Clouds rolled in, low and heavy, swallowing the last of the daylight. People rushed home, trucks loaded with groceries, doors slamming shut as heaters kicked on across town. Ethan felt it before he saw it. The air pressed down on him, dense and unforgiving. His breath fogged thick and fast as he dragged one last load of dirt toward the shelter. His fingers were numb. His shoulders screamed with fatigue. Every instinct told him to stop. Instead, he worked faster. He packed dirt along the lower stones, sealing the final gaps. He checked the tarp roof, weighed it down with boards and rocks, making sure the wind couldn't peel it away. When the first snowflakes hit his cheek, melting instantly, his stomach tightened. This was it. There would be no second chances tonight. By the time he crawled inside and pulled the entrance closed, the wind was howling. Snow slapped against the shelter walls, sharp and relentless. The sound was deafening, like the earth itself was being beaten. Ethan curled inward, pulling his jacket tight, knees tucked to his chest. He lit his candle with shaking hands, the tiny flame flickering wildly before steadying. Shadows jumped across the dirt walls. The temperature dropped fast. He could feel it in his lungs, in the way each breath stung. He pressed his palms against the stones beside him, half expecting them to be frozen solid. They weren't. They were cold, but not biting, not deadly. Minutes passed, then an hour. The storm raged on outside, but inside the shelter something strange happened. The air stopped changing. It wasn't warm, not yet. But it wasn't getting colder either. The cold no longer felt like it was chasing him. It settled, then slowed, like it had hit a wall it couldn't break through. Ethan frowned, confused. He shifted, listening. The roar of the wind was muffled now, distant, like it was happening somewhere far away. Snow piled against the outer walls, adding weight, pressing inward, insulating. The thought sent a jolt through him. He remembered a science lesson from years ago. How snow trapped air, how animals burrowed to survive winter nights, how the ground held a steady temperature even when the air above it went wild. Ethan's heart started to race, not from fear this time, but from realization. The shelter wasn't just holding up. It was working. As the night deepened, the storm intensified. Temperatures plunged well below freezing. Somewhere in town, pipes burst. Power flickered. Families huddled closer to their fireplaces, listening to the wind scream. Ethan lay still, counting his breaths, body tense but alert. He added another layer of cardboard beneath his jacket. He shielded the candle flame, conserving what little warmth it gave off. Hours passed. His fingers tingled as feeling slowly returned. His toes, once painfully numb, ached dully instead of burning. He dared to press his cheek against the dirt wall. It was cool, but steady, unchanging. A quiet laugh escaped him, thin and shaky. For the first time since being kicked out, Ethan felt something close to safety. Not comfort, not security, but survival. Sometime after midnight, exhaustion overtook him. His body, finally no longer in crisis, demanded rest. He curled tighter, the candle burned low, and sleep crept in, deep and heavy. Outside, the storm didn't care. Snow piled higher. Wind tore through the trees. Winter showed no mercy. But inside the shelter, time slowed. When Ethan woke, it was quiet. Too quiet. For a split second, panic surged through him. Had something gone wrong? Had the roof collapsed? He sat up sharply, heart pounding. The shelter held. He pushed the entrance open just enough to peer outside. White. Everything was white. Snow had buried the world overnight, transforming the lumberyard into a frozen wasteland. Drifts rose nearly to the height of the fence. The sky was pale and empty, the storm having spent itself. Ethan stepped out carefully, boots crunching against packed snow. His breath puffed in the air, but it didn't seize his chest like it had before. He looked down at his hands. They were red, chapped, but they worked. A sound caught his attention. A truck idled near the road. Two men stood nearby, staring. One of them pointed. The other shook his head slowly, disbelief written across his face. Ethan realized what they were looking at. Him. He was standing, alive, After a night everyone had assumed he wouldn't survive. The men didn't approach. They didn't speak. They just watched. Ethan met their gaze for a moment, then turned back toward his shelter. He brushed snow from the entrance, checked the walls, the roof. Everything had held. Every choice he'd made, every stone he'd placed. It mattered. As the cold morning stretched on, word began to move through town. Quietly at first, then faster. The kid behind the lumber yard made it through the storm. By evening, more cars slowed as they passed. Some people stopped outright. No one laughed this time. No one shouted. Curiosity replaced mockery. Ethan didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The storm had said enough. And winter, real winter, was only just beginning. By the next morning, Ethan could feel it. The change. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It moved quietly, like fog rolling in before anyone realized visibility was gone. But it was there. Cars slowed as they passed the lumber yard now. Not just a glance anymore. Full stops. People leaned out of windows. Some stepped out onto the frozen gravel, hands shoved deep into coat pockets, eyes fixed on the shelter half buried in snow. Ethan noticed something immediately. No one laughed. A man in a heavy jacket approached the fence cautiously, boots crunching through the ice. He didn't call out, didn't joke. He just stared, brow furrowed, as if his brain was still trying to catch up to what his eyes were seeing. "You stayed here all night?" the man finally asked. Ethan hesitated. His instinct was to retreat, to protect what little space he had carved out for himself. But something about the man's voice, curious, not cruel, made him answer. "Yeah," Ethan said simply. The man exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "It was 15 below last night." Ethan nodded. The man took a step back, like he needed distance to process that. "How?" Ethan didn't have a clean answer. Not one that fit into a sentence or two. "I just built it right," he said. The man studied him for another moment, then walked away without another word. That question followed Ethan for the rest of the day. How? It showed up in the way people looked at the shelter now. Heads tilted, eyes scanning the walls, the roof, the way snow piled up and stayed instead of sliding off. It showed up in the silence where jokes used to be. That afternoon, someone left a paper bag near the fence. Ethan spotted it from a distance and froze. He waited until the road was empty before approaching. Inside the bag were 2 sandwiches, still wrapped. A thermos sat beside them, warm to the touch. No note, no name, just food. Ethan stood there longer than he meant to, fingers tight around the bag, throat burning. He didn't cry. He didn't smile either. He just breathed. Word spread fast after that. Not the kind of rumor that painted him as a problem. This one was different. People talked about the storm, about the temperatures, about how their own houses had struggled to stay warm, and about the kid who somehow made it through the worst night of the winter in a hole behind the lumber yard. Some still doubted it. "Must have gotten lucky," a woman said at the grocery store. "One night doesn't mean anything." Others nodded in agreement. Ethan heard those voices too. The difference was, they didn't matter as much anymore, because the shelter was still standing, and it was still working. As the days passed, the temperature stayed brutal. Snowstorms came and went. Each night, Ethan crawled into his shelter with the same quiet ritual, checking the walls, sealing gaps, arranging stones he'd warmed near the candle. And each morning he emerged cold, tired, but alive. People began stopping longer. A middle-aged woman came one afternoon, eyes wide as she stepped inside the entrance just far enough to feel the air. She gasped softly, hand flying to her mouth. "It's warmer than I thought," she murmured. Ethan watched her reaction carefully, unsure what would come next. She backed out slowly, nodding to herself. "You did this all by yourself?" "Yeah," Ethan said. She hesitated, then reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a pair of thick gloves. She set them on the ground near the fence. "You'll need these," she said quietly, before walking away. Ethan picked them up later, turning them over in his hands like they might vanish if he held them too tightly. The laughter was gone now. In its place was something more dangerous. Expectation. People wanted to know more. How he'd built it. Why it worked. What he was going to do next. That attention unsettled Ethan more than the mockery ever had. He wasn't trying to prove anything. He wasn't trying to become a story. He was just trying to survive. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the snow gold, Ethan noticed a familiar face near the road. Rick. His stepfather stood there, hands in his pockets, staring. Ethan's chest tightened. Rick didn't approach, didn't wave. He just looked. At the shelter, at the tracks in the snow, at Ethan standing there very much alive. For a moment their eyes met. Rick looked away first. That night, alone in his shelter, Ethan replayed that moment over and over. Not with anger, not with satisfaction, with clarity. Rick had been wrong, not just about the shelter, about him. As winter dragged on, the shelter grew stronger. Ethan added layers, adjusted angles, learned how the air moved inside, where warmth settled, where cold tried to sneak in. He learned his shelter the way some people learned a house, by living in it, by listening. And slowly, without anyone making a big announcement, the story shifted again. It stopped being about a kid who might die out there, and started being about a kid who wouldn't. People didn't say it out loud yet, but they were thinking it. Ethan could see it in their faces. Winter wasn't over. The real tests were still ahead. But one thing was clear now, even to those who had doubted him from the start. Ethan Miller wasn't just surviving the cold. He was changing the way the town looked at him. And they weren't done watching yet. People thought the hardest part was over once winter loosened its grip. They were wrong. Spring arrived late that year, dragging its feet, leaving behind dirty snowbanks and soggy ground. The shelter survived the thaw just fine. Water drained the way Ethan had planned. The walls held. The roof didn't sag. Nothing collapsed. That alone surprised people. But what really tested their belief came later, much later. By June, winter felt like a bad memory people were eager to forget. The town returned to its usual rhythm. Baseball games, open windows, lawn chairs pulled out of garages. Folks stopped talking about the storm, stopped talking about survival, and some quietly assumed Ethan's luck had run out, because no one talked about the other extreme, the heat. It started with a week of warm days. Then, another. By July, the air turned thick and unforgiving. Temperatures climbed into the 90s and refused to come down. The kind of heat that clung to your skin, followed you indoors, and made sleep impossible. Houses baked, fans ran non-stop. Air conditioners rattled and sputtered. People complained at the diner, wiping sweat from their brows. Ethan felt it too. Outside. But inside the shelter, something strange happened. It stayed cool. Not cold, not damp. Just steady. The dirt walls absorbed the heat during the day. The stones held onto it slowly, releasing it back into the night air when temperatures dropped. The ground beneath him stayed calm and indifferent to the chaos above. Ethan noticed it the first afternoon he stepped inside after scavenging under the blazing sun. The relief hit him immediately. His shoulders relaxed. His breathing slowed. It felt like stepping into shade that never moved. He didn't tell anyone. He didn't need to. Someone else noticed first. It was Mrs. Carter, a retired school librarian who walked her dog past the lumberyard every evening. She'd been one of the first to stop laughing back in winter, one of the quiet watchers. That day, she paused at the fence, squinting at Ethan. "You all right out here?" she asked. Ethan wiped sweat from his forehead. "Yeah," she frowned. "You don't look overheated." "I'm fine," he said. She hesitated, then nodded toward the shelter. "Mind if I step in for a second?" Ethan hesitated too, but stepped aside. Mrs. Carter ducked in, expecting dirt and heat and discomfort. Instead, she stopped. "Oh," she said softly. The word hung in the air. "It's cool," she said, disbelief creeping into her voice. Ethan watched her reaction carefully. She stepped back out slowly. eyes wide, and looked at him differently than anyone else had before. Not with pity, not with curiosity, with respect. That evening she told someone. The next day, 2 more people stopped by. Then 4. By the end of the week, it wasn't just curiosity, it was confirmation. The shelter worked, not just in winter, all the time. People started asking real questions now. Thoughtful ones, about the walls, the depth, the stones, the airflow. They didn't laugh when Ethan explained. They listened. A man who worked construction stood inside for nearly 10 minutes, arms crossed, nodding to himself. "This makes sense," he muttered. "Real sense." Someone from the school district showed up next. Then a woman from a local outreach group. Not with forms, not with lectures, with water, with questions, with time. Ethan felt the shift more than he saw it. The whispers were gone. So were the assumptions. People didn't see a problem anymore. They saw potential. One afternoon, Ethan returned to the shelter to find a clipboard resting near the fence. A man in a button-down shirt stood nearby, uncomfortable in the heat. "My name's Daniel Reyes," the man said. "County Services." Ethan tensed. "I'm not here to shut anything down," Reyes added quickly. "Actually, I came to understand it." They talked for nearly an hour. About the shelter, about Ethan, about school, about options. For the first time, someone asked Ethan what he wanted. That night, lying in the steady cool of his shelter, Ethan stared up at the ceiling and thought about the last few months. Being kicked out, the cold, the laughter, the silence. And now, this. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like validation. He hadn't imagined it, hadn't gotten lucky, hadn't cheated the system. He'd learned it, built it, earned it. As summer wore on, the shelter became something else entirely. Not a secret, not a spectacle, a proof of concept. Ethan helped a neighbor reinforce an old shed, showed a kid from school how to stack stones properly, explained patiently why the ground mattered more than walls alone. He wasn't teaching because he wanted praise. He was teaching because he understood something now. Knowledge mattered more when it was shared. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the heat finally broke, Ethan sat on the edge of his shelter, watching the town glow softly in the distance. He thought about how close he'd come to disappearing, how easily his story could have ended differently. Someone sat down beside him. "Mrs. Carter. You know," she said gently, "people are talking about you." Ethan smiled faintly. "I figured." She studied him for a moment. "They're not wondering if you'll make it anymore." Ethan looked out at the horizon, the place where the sky met the land. "I know," he said. The shelter behind him stood quiet and strong, unchanged by seasons, indifferent to doubt. Winter had tested him. Summer had proven him. Now, all that remained was the question no one had asked yet. But everyone was thinking, what happens next? That answer would come soon, and when it did, it would change more than just Ethan's life. By the time fall returned, the shelter was no longer just a place to survive. It was a landmark. Leaves turned gold and red along the road by the lumber yard. The air sharpened again, carrying the familiar warning of winter. People noticed the change in the weather, and they noticed Ethan too. But this time, no one wondered whether he would make it. They already knew. Ethan stood outside the shelter one quiet morning, watching frost form on the grass. He pressed his boot into the ground, feeling how firm it still was beneath him. The stones along the wall were cool but steady, exactly the way they had been the year before. Everything was ready. Daniel Reyes from County Services returned with paperwork. Not demands, not threats, but options. A small housing program, a chance to finish school with support, a mentor willing to help him learn a trade. Ethan listened carefully. Then he surprised everyone. "I don't want to leave," he said. Daniel blinked. "Not ever. Not yet," Ethan clarified. "This place matters. It's part of how I got here." There was no argument, no pressure, just understanding. Instead of tearing the shelter down, The county worked with him. They helped reinforce it safely, made it legal, made it visible, not as a problem, but as a solution. Ethan split his days between school and work now, learning carpentry from a local builder who'd once laughed at the idea of a kid surviving out here. Nights were still spent in the shelter, but they felt different, warmer, not because of the walls, but because Ethan knew he belonged somewhere again. Word spread beyond the town. People drove in from neighboring counties to see the shelter. Some came out of curiosity. Others came with notebooks, questions, quiet hope in their eyes. Parents, veterans, young people who felt stuck. Ethan didn't give speeches. He showed them. He showed them the stones. The way the walls angled inward. The way the ground did half the work if you respected it instead of fighting it. This isn't about being tough, he told one man who asked how he'd survived alone. It's about paying attention. The man nodded slowly, like the answer landed somewhere deeper than expected. One afternoon, Ethan found himself standing in front of a small group of kids from his old school. The same ones who had laughed months earlier. They didn't laugh now. They listened. That night, as Ethan sat inside the shelter, candle flickering softly, he thought back to the night he'd been kicked out. The cold porch, the door closing, the feeling that his life had just ended before it really started. He realized something then. That moment hadn't destroyed him. It had defined him, not because he suffered, but because he chose what to do next. The shelter stood quiet around him, unchanged by seasons, indifferent to doubt, steady in a way few things in life ever are. It had taught him something no classroom ever could, that you don't need permission to build something meaningful, only courage. As winter crept closer again, Ethan prepared, not with fear but with confidence. He'd already faced the worst once. He knew what worked. He trusted himself now, and so did the town. On the first snow of the season, Ethan stepped outside and watched flakes drift down, slow and gentle. He smiled, pulling his jacket tighter, not because he was cold, but because he remembered a time when this moment would have terrified him. Now it didn't, because he had a home, one he built with his own hands. Before the story ends, let me ask you something. What would you have done if you were 15 years old? With no money, no place to go, and no one coming to help? Would you have given up? Or would you have tried to build something, anything, to survive? And how many people around us right now are stronger than we think, simply because no one ever stopped to look? If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you see the world a little differently, subscribe to the channel for more powerful, human stories like this one. Every week, we share real feeling journeys about resilience, survival, and the quiet strength it takes to keep going when the world turns its back. Because sometimes, the most important homes aren't the ones we're given. They're the ones we choose to build. See you in the next story.